Imagine you are standing in a space so narrow your shoulders almost touch both sides of the cold sandstone walls. Above you, a thin sliver of blue sky is the only reminder that a vast open world still exists. You step down onto a massive boulder wedged between the canyon walls, planning to swing yourself lower. But the moment your weight shifts, the earth moves. It is not a slow slide, but a sudden violent drop. In a fraction of a second, an 800-pound slab of rock slips. Before your brain can even register the danger, your hand is caught in the gap. There is a dull, heavy thud, followed by a cold, numbing sensation that quickly blooms into white-hot, blinding agony. You pull back instinctively, but nothing happens. Your right wrist is completely flattened, pinned hard against the ancient stone wall. You are suspended in mid-air, held up only by your trapped limb. The silence of the desert returns, heavier than before, broken only by the sound of your own rapid, terrified breathing. You are entirely alone, miles from the nearest road, and no one in the world knows where you are. This was the exact reality that Aron Ralston faced on a warm spring afternoon. Aron was not a careless novice. He was a 27-year-old mechanical engineer, an elite mountaineer and a former member of a mountain rescue. He was a man who lived for the thrill of testing his limits against the wilderness. He had climbed dozens of Colorado's highest peaks alone in the dead of winter, proving his meticulous planning and physical endurance. But on this morning, a small lapse in protocol set a trap that no amount of training could easily undo. Aron had packed his gear, loaded his mountain bike, and headed into the remote wilderness of southeastern Utah without leaving an itinerary. He did not tell his roommates, his family, or his friends exactly where he was going. He simply told them he was heading to the Red Rock country of Utah. His destination was Blue John Canyon, a highly technical, deep slot canyon located in the Robber's Roost area. This geography is beautiful but incredibly dangerous. Over millions of years, flash floods have carved deep, winding cracks through the Navajo sandstone, creating passages that are sometimes only a couple of feet wide. In many places, large rocks called chalk stones remain suspended high above the canyon floor, wedged in place by gravity at tapered shape of the walls. To traverse these slot canyons, a hiker must climb over, slide under, or rappel down these suspended boulders. Aron was navigating one of these narrow drops when he reached for a large chalk stone to help him downclimb. It was a maneuver he had performed hundreds of times before, but sandstone is unstable, and the massive rock shifted, rolling down and trapping his right hand against the canyon wall like a vice. In the immediate aftermath of the impact, Aron's system flooded with adrenaline. He tried to pull his arm free, but the sheer physics of the situation made it impossible. The human body cannot generate enough force to budge an 800-pound boulder, especially when standing in a cramped slot canyon with no leverage. Aron tried to chip away at the rock using a small pocket knife he had brought with, hoping to crumble the sandstone enough to slide his hand out. But the blade was part of a cheap, low-quality multi-tool, and the hard stone quickly dulled the metal, leaving nothing but fine red dust and small scratches. He rigged up a pulley system using his climbing ropes and anchor, attempting to use mechanical advantage to lift the boulder. He pulled until the ropes groaned under the tension, but the rock remained perfectly still. Every attempt to free himself only wasted his energy and depleted his small supply of water. As the first night descended on the canyon, the psychological battle began. Slot canyons are notoriously cold at night, acting as natural refrigerators that trap freezing air. Aron was dressed only in a short-sleeved shirt and shorts. Without room to move, his body began to shiver violently, a physiological response to hypothermia as his core temperature dropped. He had to fight to stay awake, knowing that if he lost consciousness, he might slip and put his full weight on his crushed wrist, cutting off what little blood flow remained. The darkness in the canyon was absolute, and the silence was deafening. Every rustle of the wind or sound of crumbling rock mocked him, reminding him of how far away help truly was. By the second and third days, a more insidious killer began to take hold: severe dehydration. Aron had entered the canyon with less than a liter of water and 2 simple burritos. He rationed the water strictly, taking tiny sips. But in the dry desert air, his body was losing moisture rapidly through respiration and sweat. Dehydration changes the chemistry of the human body. As blood volume drops, The heart must beat faster to pump the remaining thickened blood to vital organs. The kidneys begin to conserve water, causing urine to turn dark and eventually stop forming altogether. Aron's mouth grew dry, his tongue swelled, and a constant burning thirst dominated his thoughts. When his water supply finally ran out, he resorted to the ultimate survival measure of drinking his own collected urine. This provided a brief psychological comfort, but biologically, it was a desperate cycle that recycled metabolic waste back into his failing system. With dehydration came vivid hallucination. The line between reality and dreams a blur. Aron found himself talking to video cameras, recording farewell messages to his mother, his father, and his sister. These recordings were not just for comfort. They were designed as a forensic record of his final day, so that whoever eventually found his body would know what had happened to him. In his waking dreams, he saw himself playing with a young, one-armed boy. He saw friends, family, and warmth, only to snap back to the harsh reality of the cold, damp sandstone pressing against his back. His mind was beginning to fracture under the weight of his isolation and the certainty of his impending death. By the fourth day, Aron's trapped right hand was showing signs of severe necrosis. Because the boulder had cut off all arterial blood flow, the tissue in his hand was deprived of oxygen and nutrients. Cells began to die and rupture, releasing toxic proteins into the dead limb. The skin turned a dark, bruised gray, and the hand began to decompose while still attached to his body. When Aron poked his thumb with his pocket knife, he felt no pain, and he watched in morbid fascination as gas hissed out from the decaying tissue. It was a stark biological realization. His hand was already dead, and if he did not free himself soon, the decay would spread up his arm, causing systemic blood poisoning, organ failure, and certain death. The engineering mindset that had guided Aron's life now became his only hope for survival. He realized that he could not cut through his bone with a dull 2-inch blade, but he also realized that bones are rigid structures subject to the laws of physics. His forearm contained 2 long bones, the radius and the ulna. If he could use the boulder as a fixed point and his own body as a lever, he might be able to apply enough torque to snap them. This was not a rash decision, but a calculated, desperate execution of mechanical force. On the morning of the 6th day, Aron decided it was time to act. He stood up and threw his weight violently to one side, forcing his arm to bend against the natural angle of his wrist. A loud, sickening crack echoed through the narrow canyon as his radius bone snapped. The pain was immediate and blinding, but it was also a spark of hope. He adjusted his position, bending his arm upward with everything he had, until the second bone, the ulna, snapped with another sharp pop. He had successfully broken the structural core of his arm, but he was still bound to the rock by muscle, skin, tendons, and nerves. Aron reached for his cheap multi-tool and opened the dull blade. He knew he had to be precise. He applied a makeshift tourniquet to his upper arm using the tubing from his hydration bladder, tightening it to restrict blood flow so he would not bleed to death during the process. He then began the agonizing task of cutting through his own flesh. The blade was so dull that it could barely cut the skin, forcing him to scrape and saw back and forth through the muscle. He had to use the pliers on his multi-tool to pull and tear at the tough, white tendons that refused to cut. The most terrifying moment came when he reached the main nerves. The radial and ulnar nerves carry sensory information directly to the brain, and touching them with a dull blade sent waves of pure white-hot agony through his entire nervous system. Aron later described the feeling as sticking his entire arm into a bucket of liquid fire. He had to pause, breathe, and consciously push through the pain, knowing that any hesitation would mean dying in that slot. Step by step, fiber by fiber, he severed the connections. Finally, with one last cut, the tension broke. The weight of his body pulled him backward, and he fell to the canyon floor, free for the first time in over 120 hours. But Aron was far from safe. He was standing at the bottom of a remote canyon, severely dehydrated, malnourished, and missing his right hand. He had to apply a fresh bandage to his stump, secure his remaining arm in a sling, and begin the long journey back to civilization. The physical toll of his escape was immense, but his survival instincts remained sharp. He managed to climb out of the slot canyon, navigating the uneven terrain with only one hand. He then reached a 65-foot sheer cliff that he had to descend, Rigging a rappel with his remaining hand, he slid down the rope, landing heavily on the canyon floor below. Now on the canyon floor, Aron began a 7-mile hike out of the desert heat. Every step was a battle against shock and blood loss. The human body under extreme stress can perform incredible physical feats due to adrenaline, but eventually the physiological reserves run dry. He was stumbling, weak, and losing vision. After hiking for several miles, he spotted 3 people in the distance, a family of tourists who were hiking in the area. They saw a man covered in dust and blood stumbling toward them and immediately ran to him. They gave him water, food, and began walking him to safety. At the same time, a search and rescue helicopter was already in the air. Aron's family, realizing he had not returned, had managed to piece together his possible locations and alerted the authorities. The helicopter spotted the group of hikers in the open desert and touched down nearby. Within minutes, Aron was loaded onto the aircraft and flown to a hospital, ending his grueling ordeal just hours before his body would have succumbed to blood loss and organ failure. The recovery was long and difficult. The human body is remarkably resilient, but the trauma of self-amputation and extreme dehydration requires intensive medical intervention. Doctors had to clean and close his wound, manage his severe dehydration, and monitor him for crush. When muscles are crushed for long periods, they release myoglobin, potassium, into the blood. If the blood flow is restored too quickly, these toxins can flood the kidneys and heart, causing sudden cardiac arrest or kidney failure. Because Aron had amputated his arm before the boulder was removed, he had inadvertently saved himself from the lethal effects of crush syndrome, as the tourniquet prevented the toxic blood from his dead hand from circulating back in his body. The psychological aftermath of such an event is often more complex than the physical healing. Survivors of extreme trauma frequently experience post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, and phantom limb pain. The sensation that the missing hand is still there, sometimes still feeling the crushing weight of the rock. Aron, however, chose to view his survival not as a tragedy, but a profound triumph for the humans. He went on to help design specialized prosthetic limbs that allowed him to return to his passion for climbing. He eventually completed his goal of climbing all of Colorado's highest peaks, proving that his physical limitations could not diminish his love for the mountain. Forensic analysis of his survival highlights several critical lessons for anyone venturing into the wilderness. The most important is the simple rule of communication. Leaving an itinerary with someone back home is the single most effective way to ensure a rescue in the event of an accident. Without that information, search and rescue teams are forced to scan thousands of square miles of rugged terrain, often looking for a needle in a haystack. Additionally, carrying high-quality survival gear, including a reliable sharp knife and adequate water, can mean the difference between life and death in a sudden crisis. Aron Ralston's story remains one of the most astonishing accounts of self-rescue in human history. It serves as a stark reminder of the fragile boundary between adventure and disaster, and the incredible, almost terrifying lengths to which a human being will go when forced to choose between a limb and life. Sometimes, the heaviest rocks we encounter in life are not meant to crush us, but to show us exactly what we are willing to leave behind to survive.